afternoon. My name is Josephine Olson. I'm the interim director of the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome to this month's Conversation on Europe, which is part of our year of challenges facing Europe. Today's topic is entitled Legacies and Manifestations of Irish Nationalism and Irish National Identity in the EU and the UK in the context of Brexit. Today's conversation is sponsored by the European Studies Center, which is part of the University Center for International Studies at Pitt. It is co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. Our co-sponsors are the Georgia Tech Center for European and Transatlantic Studies, the Miami, Florida Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, the European Union Center at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at the University of Florida, the Center for European Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. To learn more about our upcoming conversations on Europe, as well as other programming, please visit our website, which we will put in the chat. Here you can find recordings of past conversations and additional materials. I would like to thank Ingrid Gomez-O'Toole for her help with today's event. You will have the opportunity to ask questions during the panel. Please feel free to post a question at any time during the discussion. We recommend that you use the Q&A rather than the chat. We will try to get as many of your questions as we can. This conversation on Europe was organized by Professor Jennifer Keating of the Department of English at the University of Pittsburgh. Now I would like to turn the program over to Professor Keating, who will introduce the panelists and moderate the discussion. Jennifer?
Thank you so much, Professor Olson, and thanks as well to Ingrid for their help in facilitating today's conversation on Europe. The topic today we're looking at is legacies and manifestations of Irish nationalism and Irish national identity in the EU and the UK in the context of Brexit. It's an incredibly long title for our conversation, but it also notes the complexity of the political and economic reality of the effects of Brexit in Northern Ireland and in Ireland. This has been a long, precarious, and complex trajectory since David Cameron's referendum on the UK's exit from the EU back in 2016. And the events of recent history have complicated this further. As Ireland, the EU, Northern Ireland, and the UK work out the details of the protocol, features of recent history continue to influence and weigh on this process as well. Brexit has had enormous influences and adverse implications for relationships between not just the EU and the UK, but specifically Ireland and the UK. A Northern Ireland assembly that fails to sit complicates matters further, where the Northern Ireland electorate is suspended in its articulation of political will, with an assembly under direction from Westminster, not Stormont. Recent historical emergences from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, wherein the UK and the EU support Ukraine's efforts to defend itself, but this support is complicated by member states like Ireland who remain officially neutral all the way to responses to COVID-19 in recent years across the border and on either side of the border, reflect a multitude of responses and tensions between the individual member states and the transnational unions. In our session today, we will recognize the legislative, political, and economic features of this series of complex relationships. We will acknowledge their effects on individual and collective identity, but we will also consider a series of explorations, interrogations, and interventions from our panel of academics, artists, and writers. I look forward to a dynamic conversation, and I hope you will join in once the talks are given. In a moment, I will introduce each of our panelists, who will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and our respondent, who will help us cascade into our discussion. Before I do so, a few housekeeping items. As Professor Olson mentioned, please use the Q&A with questions. Feel free to post those as the talks continue to go. I'll keep track of them and then use them for our subsequent discussion. I'll be posting some links in the chat as well with some further information. And I do want to say thank you to all of you for making the time to join us today. I'm looking forward to our shared discussion. So our first speaker today, Professor Eve Patton, will introduce us to the Long Room Hub at Trinity College Dublin. She'll also introduce us to her ongoing work with the All Ireland Initiative in collaboration with Professor Garrett, Carr, and others. She'll attend to Mairead McLean's Beyond 22 project in collaboration with the Virtual Record Treasury, supported by the Irish government. Professor Patton is a professor of English and the director of the Trinity Long Room Hub at Trinity College Dublin. She joined the School of English in 1996 after spending several years working in the British Council in university education in Eastern Europe. At Trinity, she teaches 19th and 20th century Irish studies, 20th century British fiction, and the literature of war. She's the current co-director of the MPhil in Irish Writing in Trinity, vice chair of the Royal Irish Academy Committee for Irish Literatures in English, and a member of the editorial board for the Irish University Review. Until recently, she served as secretary of the National Association for English Studies, through which she maintains close links with the European Society for the Study of English. Professor Patton's primary research interests are in 19th century Irish literature and culture. In 2004, she published Samuel Ferguson and the Culture of 19th Century Ireland with Dublin Four Courts, and she has since developed this work into several research papers on civic institutions and the middle class in Victorian Dublin. Her other research connections are to 20th century British and Irish writing, particularly the fiction of the two world wars. In 2008, she co-edited Literatures of War, the proceedings of the 2007 conference of the Lawrence Durrell School, and she wrote Imperial Refugee, Olivia Manning's Fictions of War, which was published by Cork University Press in 2011. In her ongoing work, she is particularly interested in Irish literary connections across Europe, and she has begun work on a series of essays on the English literati in Ireland from 1920 to 1945. Following Professor Patton's talk, we'll be hearing from Mairead McLean. She'll discuss her residency at the Long Room Hub and her recent project Beyond 22 Archive, which was part of the Decade of Centenaries program in Ireland, running in collaboration with the Trinity College Long Room Hub in Dublin and the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland. Mairead McLean uses material from a diverse range of sources in her films: found footage, historical and family archives, filmed performances, and televisual media appear in many of her single-screen films and installations. Her work often features people as they cope with forms of control, whether the camera follows actual events or follows enactments by a performer. People are seen to challenge or circumvent authority or to improvise with their own actions. She currently works between Northern Ireland and Bath, UK. She's produced films and installations for galleries and museums since 1989, and she has received awards in the UK, Ireland, France, and Russia. In April 2021, she was selected as Artist in Residence at the Long Room Hub, which she will discuss today. In 2018, she was commissioned by the Wapping Project, London, to produce a multi-screen installation called Making Her Mark, and a film called A Line Was Drawn, which used the poetics of performance to explore the concept of borders from multiple viewpoints. This work was filmed and exhibited in a solo show in the Outer Hebrides in 2018 and shown at the BFI London Film Festival, Experimenta 2019. Her video work, No More, exploring questions around the introduction of internment without trial in Northern Ireland in 1971, won the inaugural MAC International Prize, Belfast in 2014. And that is currently housed at the Irish Museum of Modern Art and held in the Arts Council of Northern Ireland. Lastly, Garrett Carr will discuss his book, The Rule of Land, as well as recent mapping projects and what he describes as the winter of discontent. Garrett Carr is a senior lecturer at the Seamus Heaney Centre at Queen's University Belfast. He teaches creative writing at all levels within the English subject area, from stage 1 undergraduate through MA level teaching and supervision of PhDs. The Rule of the Land, Walking Ireland's Border, came out with Faber and Faber in 2017. It's his most recent work. It was widely and positively reviewed and has gained significant media attention. The book and his curatorial roles form the basis of his impact case study for REF 2021, Politics, Landscape, and Identity in Ireland's Border. He's currently developing impact projects for the next REF, likely to be in 2028. He's made 3 commissioned programs for the BBC Radio 4 and presented the book program for RTE Ireland. He is also a frequent contributor to the press, the BBC, and other newspapers and broadcasters across the Anglophile world, like the New York Times, The Guardian, and The Economist. He has a background in visual art, and this remains part of his research. He makes maps that he exhibits widely. They've been selected for inclusion in government and university collections. He also curates a touring exhibition called Mapping Alternative Ulster, funded by the Arts Council of Northern Ireland. It's an exhibition of maps created by independent cartographers and has received wide media attention. It first ran in Belfast's Ulster Museum in 2015, and it most recently ran in Donegal's Regional Cultural Centre in 2022. And last but not least, our respondent today is John Carson. Professor John Carson is an artist whose work has explored various media contexts and strategies. He's presented live performances, made sound works and CDs, broadcast work on television and radio, created installations, and both as a curator and artist, he has been involved in many types of public art projects. He's exhibited drawings, photographs, prints, and sculpture in such venues as the Douglas Hyde Gallery in Dublin, the ICA in London, CCA in Glasgow, Icon Gallery in Birmingham, Perth Institute of Contemporary Art in Australia, the Ain Art Museum in Tornio, Finland, PS1 in New York, New Langton Arts in San Francisco, and the Mattress Factory in Pittsburgh. He received his Bachelor's of Fine Art degree from the University of Ulster, Belfast, and a master's degree at the California Institute of Arts. From 2006 to 2016, he was head of the School of Art at Carnegie Mellon University, where he taught until 2022. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the Zoom floor to Professor Patton, and I look forward to everybody's contribution to the conversation after our panelists have finished speaking.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you as well to the European Studies Centre for hosting this discussion. I'm delighted to be joining this conversation. As Jennifer has mentioned, my name is Eve Patton, and I'm Director of the Trinity Longroom Hub Arts and Humanities Research Institute at Trinity College in Dublin. That's a bit of a mouthful. We're more commonly known as the Hub. And what do? We coordinate arts and humanities research across university schools, across various research projects. We host a number of international visiting researchers, and we also host, I'm pleased to say, occasional residencies for artists such as Mairead, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that. And we also coordinate and help present the work of Trinity College Library. So we're quite busy and we do many things, and I've put some links about the work of the Hub into the chat, which I'll refer to as we go through. So if you're interested, you can follow some of the work. But one of the reasons I'm particularly glad to be thinking about the Hub's work in this context is because of that strange geographical position that we occupy, not only at the centre of Trinity College, not only at the very centre of Dublin, but also in an Ireland, which at the moment I think is looking two ways at once. Ireland is looking very much eastward to Europe. We are the westernmost territory of Europe and the remaining English-speaking country, of course, in the European Union. But at the same time, of course, Ireland looks very frequently to its Irish-American connections and looks westward and to legacies that I think we're still exploring. And one of the things I think we're able to do with our researchers in the Hub is to dovetail those two ways of looking and to be a kind of translation point between the overlapping identities and interests that West and East can present. How do we do this, and what kind of questions are we asking? At the moment, we're asking about Europe. What does it mean to be European in 2023? And what does it mean to have a European culture and identity at the same time as retaining an Irish national definition? At the moment, we're marking 50 years since Ireland joined the European Union. Of course, at the time, 50 years ago, a number of people were very skeptical about what that union would mean. I often think of the historian E.P. Thompson, who was extremely skeptical and said the project was bound to fail. It was, he said, like 9 middle-aged couples with failing marriages meeting in a darkened bedroom in a Brussels hotel. Luckily, he was wrong. I think the idea of Europe has been a tremendous success, and particularly for Ireland, and the excitement and enthusiasm for Europe over those 50 years has, if anything, increased. Over the past couple of months in the Trinity Long Room Hub, we have run the first of a series of seminars called Visions of Europe in Irish Cultural Debate. And again, I put a link to a recently recorded seminar in the series in the chat for you, because people listening may be interested to hear some of the comments from my colleagues on questions about an Irish European identity, particularly in the context that Jennifer talked about, the context of Brexit and a British withdrawal from Europe. Of the many things that came out of that discussion, I think some will be familiar to you. The sense in particular, first of all, of an older Ireland that saw itself as European in terms of its connections to a classical heritage and to the idea of a European educational identity, that Ireland has always been, and particularly since medieval times, a centre of learning and a centre of enlightenment, and that scholars would come to Ireland in the Middle Ages to seek out learning, to seek out knowledge. And that sense of connection through education, scholarship, learning, and through a classical heritage is, I think, something we're looking at very closely in the current era. We're also looking at languages. One of my colleagues who speaks on the seminar, Michael Cronin, who is a professor of languages, uses the very interesting term linguistic hospitality to think about a new European identity, of which Ireland and indeed the Irish language are a natural part. Linguistic hospitality means, he says, an openness to all of those languages that tend to lie beneath the mainstream English that we speak in Ireland, and for you guys, the mainstream American English that you speak. There are many small languages, many minority languages, many vulnerable languages that sit alongside Irish, such as Catalan, for example, or Welsh, or Low German, and there are many, many more that we need to be hospitable to, because these represent, he suggests, the kind of minority identities that can very often be swamped by the interests of nation forming and nationalism. And the third thing that the seminar participants turn to again and again is the role of literature and the visual arts in founding and protecting Ireland's European identity. I think for many people listening to this, the case of literature has been well rehearsed, and we think of Oscar Wilde, of James Joyce, of Samuel Beckett, of course, heading naturally to Europe, heading through France and onwards to solidify the sense of an Irish-European connection in their diverse ways. But recently in the Trinity Long Room Hub, we've been lucky to think a little bit more about the visual arts, and this is what I want to come to conclude what I'm saying. We've looked increasingly at Irish art as a natural bridge to Europe. Just at the beginning of 2022, we hosted the centenary of the Irish art exhibition that was held in Paris in 1922 in a digital project called Seeing Ireland, created by my colleague Kieran O'Neill at the Hub. Again, we're going to put the link into the chat for you, I hope, because you'll see the natural home of Irish art in Paris in 1922, and a version of Irish art that expressed a very sophisticated kind of Irish identity. We've also had artists in residence who have naturally looked to Europe for their ideas, for their imaginative resources. And just at the start of the pandemic, we hosted the Irish artist Rita Duffy, who is, among many things, an artist who uses parody a great deal. And one of the things she let us do was to hang on the side of the Hub building the canvas of her wonderful parody of the the painter Géricault's Raft of the Medusa, this wonderful painting of the survivors of a French naval shipwreck. It was painted in the early 19th century, who were lost at sea and disorientated. But what, of course, Rita Duffy was able to do was reimagine the Raft of the Medusa for an age of Brexit, of the disorientation of public identities and of national identities in the wake of the Brexit crisis that, of course, had destabilized the idea of belonging and location and positioning for so many people, and in many ways cast us all into the sea. Ireland after Brexit, just to finish, has been a period of some ironies, not least that the passing of the Brexit bill coincided with the centenary of partition in Ireland that Jennifer also mentioned. We've been looking back, of course, 100 years to partition, to the division of Ireland, and using it, I think, to think about questions of what it means to be European. Where does Europe end? Where does Europe begin? At times, the political idea of Europe has been a kind of easy resolution, a kind of imaginative refuge to get away from an Irish-British identity crisis, to get away from the history of partition. But of course, Europe as an imaginative sanctuary is itself a problem. What Europe brings with it is its own borders, its own histories of partition, division, of many countries that themselves have either been divided or that continue to experience ethnic and territorial conflicts and trauma. So taking on that version of Europe for Ireland has been extremely informative and a responsibility I think researchers in the Trinity Longroom Hub look to with a great deal of attention. And my two co-panelists today, I hope will pick this up. The artist Mairead McLean, who was with us as an artist in residence, working on the archives over the past year and a half, taught me a great deal about borders and European identity. And in her tremendous piece of work, A Line Was Drawn, she helped me to think about the question of those imaginative lines and those legislative lines that have been drawn across territories where there is in reality no evidence of separation or differentiation. And she prompted me to begin a research collaboration with Garrett Carr, who's also joining us today, under the framework of the Shared Island Initiative. And we are currently embarking on a project with our researcher, Orla Flanagan, to try to diagnose the nature of Ireland border culture. What does it mean to have a border, and what kind of identity and culture has that shaped? A question which will prompt us to look to literature, to photography, to sculpture and the other visual arts, to journalism, and of course, to history. I think that question of an Irish border is also very much a broader European question. And possibly, Jennifer, it's also a question in the US as the long echoes of the build a wall rhetoric still sound for us. So how do we respond to these lines of division that underlie the parallel histories of nationalism and nation building in the modern era and in Europe? These are questions that we're all talking about in the Trinity Longroom Hub. And at that point, I'll close in the hope that we can come back to these and hand over to Mairead McLean.
Thank you very much, Eve. That was terrific. And definitely there'll be points I'll be picking up there. So what I am going to do now, let's hope this little bit of technology works, is I'm going to share my screen, and I want to run through some images and talk through, I'll try not to be breakneck speed, talk through the images as I go. So I will just start by saying I'm going to be doing a little bit of time traveling here. So apologies in advance if you're experiencing any interference along the way. And I'll try as much as I can to if I go off track, I will pull myself back in again and dial back into this channel. So let me just make sure this is going. Yeah, so I'm going to start here, which is at the end of June 2022, after an exhausting whirlwind of a year, when the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland officially launched in the week of the 100-year anniversary of the destruction of the Four Courts complex in Dublin. So here am I, as you can see in the photograph, with the Taoiseach and the Minister of Culture, very much relieved, like all of the team who are working on this project, that we've gotten this far. As you know, the Four Courts was the site of the purpose-built repository of the Irish Record Treasury, which was built in 1867, which held 700 years of the country's archives before it was destroyed by fire after the buildings were shelled in the opening engagement of the Irish Civil War. So the late Oqui Nwezor, in his curatorship of Documenta 11, held in Germany in 2022, that's 20 years ago now, talked about his idea of thinking historically in the present and about critically centering the past within the contemporary moment. Since then, these concepts have been percolating through the visual arts sector. The work artists have been producing with historical or political subjects as material have been recognized as having the potential to enable or allow for nuanced conversations around, among other things, post-colonial subjectivity. Of particular interest to me in this discussion is the idea of the body as repository or site of memory, as seen in my earlier films, No More, Jennifer mentioned, 2023, and Broadcast in 2016, which are rooted in my own family history. So my brief as part of the residency at the Longroom Hub was to witness the Record Treasury team at work to respond creatively to how this group of historians, computer scientists based at the Trinity College Dublin, and the archivists and conservators based at several archives, the National Archives Ireland in Dublin, Public Records Office in Northern Ireland and Belfast, and in London, the National Archives at Kew. So they were working together to bring original documents saved from the fire back to life while hunting down copies, transcriptions and facsimiles of those that had not survived, as well as locating original documents that were not in the building at the time of the fire. So again, sort of moving back in time, I'm back at Christmas 2021, 4 months into the project for me, and I realized the enormity of this undertaking. I had been tuning into the weekly team Zoom meetings, which had started 3 years earlier, and was beginning, I was beginning to see this vast archival recovery project as a cracked bowl being mended through the Japanese method of kintsugi. For those who don't know what kintsugi is, this is where a broken object, rather than being discarded, is repaired with gold sort of bonding material. In this way, the breaks are not hidden or disguised, but rather the mending is made a feature of. The cracks and the repair of each crack tell us something about the history of the object itself. And I think it's funny that in this new version, now it becomes stronger and more valuable than it had been before. It was broken. The gold shows the precious nature and the uniqueness of each piece, and it becomes larger than the sum of its parts. It becomes stronger. It can be appreciated and valued because it survived, and it can go on to fulfill a purpose. So among many things, and Eve mentioned a couple of my films, earlier films, but among the things that the Virtual Record Treasury is bringing together for the first time is 8,000 known maps of Ireland. And I have had an interest in maps and mapping for as long as I remember, from learning to orienteer with simple maps around the Gorchant Lanes in County Tyrone, where I come from, at school, to learning how to use the underground rail map and to travel around London when I was an art student in the city. So the two films I made, 2018, 2019, Making Her Mark and A Line was drawn. In these films, the human demand to demarcate the land is called into question as a performer moves through an ever-changing environment. The lines she draws with difficulty, she's working with a large pencil, are washed away by the waves, covered by tides or vegetation, or swept into the air by the wind. The more I researched, the more I started to think of my role as artist in residence as one who could map what was occurring in front of my eyes. I could map what the team were doing, what they were unearthing, and the systems they were using to do it. I could follow the journey of a burnt document from the conservator's table through to the digitization, transcription, and finally to the output as it was made available on the open source website of the Virtual Record Treasury. I began to sort of think a bit about the work of the surveyors and the cartographers in the early days, and as well as the mapping of Ireland itself. And I could go, but I won't have time to talk about the Down survey map, which is the first ever detailed land survey on a national scale anywhere in the world in the late 1600s. But I was also very curious to read about other, and Eve mentions this, territorial land surveying in other parts of the world. One that in America, I'd say everybody will be familiar with, was the Mason-Dixon line, surveyed in 1763 to 67 to help solve a dispute over territory in colonial America that had begun a century earlier. A dispute over territory that had started 100 years earlier. That's a long-running dispute. In looking in this particular demarcation line, I realized how border lines change, how their function can change, and how they can be superseded by other boundaries as the ownership of land around them changes, as our world changes. And again, thinking back to thinking historically in the present. So, and on to this beautiful jar of fragments, okay, that I came across on the shelf of the conservation room at the National Archives of Ireland. The chipped edges had come off the bindings or the covers of books or corners of documents and manuscripts from different historical periods that were being restored. I imagined this jar to contain 100 years of Irish history. Looking down into the jar, I could see small, crispy burnt bits waiting for someone to notice them. There seemed to be nothing of note there. Maybe a letter or a burnt or a word, but mostly the fragments were blank. But yet it was these that drew me in. Watching the conservators at work, I saw how they recognized the edge of books or manuscripts as weak points. They were very careful when cleaning the outer edges because they knew through experience that they could break easily. I watched the historians examine the repaired book, and I noticed that in order to access or read the information in the book, they had to touch the edge of the page because this was their way in. I saw how they held the page between the finger and the thumb before turning the page. And I thought about how a reader uses the corner of or the edge to move to the next page. The more readers of the page, the weaker the edge becomes. When a book is archived, the edges can experience wear and tear when they are moved from shelf to viewing table and back. And in the explosion and the subsequent fire in 1922, it was these outer edges of the manuscripts and books, the front and back covers, which took the biggest hit in the bomb blast, which made me think again of borders and boundaries, of disputed territories, of the precious nature of living near, or the precarious nature, of living or near them. So back to the film I'm making and to fragmentation or the fragmentary, which is an underlying theme that is emerging as I work through the chapters or section of this film that I'm doing now. From kintsugi to surveying plots of land, to broken off edges of repaired documents, to disappearing lines on a map, to real and imagined borders, to the fragility of the spaces near those weakened edges, and finally to finding strength when people work together towards a common goal. So the last thing I'll leave you with refers back to this idea of the long history of disputes and the idea of critically centering the past within this contemporary moment. In his thesis on the philosophy of history, Walter Benjamin uses the term Jetztzeit, which is a kind of a now time, and he describes a notion of time that is ripe with a revolutionary possibility, time that has been detached from the continuum of history. And he says that this Jetztzeit isn't naturally occurring, but however, it takes the intervention of an artist or a revolutionary to produce it by blasting it free from the ceaseless flow in which it would otherwise be trapped. So my film will be finished later this year, and I hope that some of you will get the chance to see it. And I welcome some more conversation about this very fast chat that we're having today. But thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen and I will pass over to Garrett. Thank you very much. Garrett, can you do your shit? Yes.
Yes. Hello, everyone. That was all fascinating. Thanks, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen now. Thank you to everyone in Pittsburgh for inviting me along. And thanks to Jen, especially. Let's have a look now. I'm going to project this. Can you see that then? Yeah, I'm getting some nods. Very good. Thank you. I just came up with that title today because it's snowing and everyone's discontented. So that's it. So I'm going to talk about some forms in which that discontent is taking shape in the way I'm recording it and even participating occasionally. Jennifer in introduction mentioned the suspension, the closing of the Northern Irish Parliament, the political assembly, meant a suspension of the articulation of a political will, which is nice phrasing. So I'm looking at some other articulations of political will that are going on that continue without the presence of the Parliament. First of all, just to introduce myself, my name is Garrett Carr. I work for Queen's University, Belfast, among other things. And I work in the Seamus Heaney Centre, which is a centre for all forms of creative writing. And indeed, other forms of creativity as well. We often have all sorts of collaborations going on with other people. And as Jen mentioned at the beginning, I do have a visual practice as well. And indeed, my office looks a wee bit more like a studio, to be honest, with bits of paper laying everywhere. I'm not in it now, I'm at home right now. So the context for our discontent at the moment and getting us back into the European question is triggered by UK's decision to leave the EU, and that means Northern Ireland going along with it, and hence the difficulty. A lot of the EU project is quite boring stuff about trade and VAT and trade routes and laws of origin and various things like this. So, and things we never really had to deal with. But then very quickly, it was realized that if Northern Ireland was going to be outside of the EU, while the Republic of Ireland remained in the EU, then there was going to have to be some sort of border infrastructure to, especially to police trade, to track where things were coming and going. One thing that's very important to the EU is its market area. There's free trade within the EU, and stuff can move across borders, and people can move across borders with very smoothly. So, and it's very important to protect that. So it looked like we were going to need a border there. Now, of course, you already have a border there, I hear you cry, but it was an open border. Since both the UK and Ireland had joined the EU, there was no restrictions there at all, and traffic was flowing back and forth freely, and it was in a sense invisible. And this, of course, had political use as well, because there's a significant portion of the population in Northern Ireland would rather not have the border there at all, would rather simply have a united Ireland. So the EU umbrella, trade umbrella, made that whole softened the Irish border to such an extent it was practically invisible, and that enabled a cultural coming together and was a perfect foundation for the peace process, and the peace indeed that we've enjoyed now since the late 20th century. So it looked like, however, we're going to have to put some infrastructure back on the border. And a lot of people are unhappy about this and nervous about what that would actually look like. So I'm just checking the time. I don't want to overrun. Oh, 1:45. Okay. So next thing, this was proposed instead, which is instead of doing our checks along the Irish border, along the land border, we just look at stuff that's coming into Northern Ireland. There's not that much, you know, it'll be all right. And anything that's going to go from Northern Ireland into the EU, it can be examined on the at the ports instead, and that seems like quite a good solution, because there's only maybe 3 ports where stuff is imported, and you put your infrastructure there, and the land border stays open, and that's all should be all right. And indeed, that's what was signed up to, and a thing called a protocol, which there's a brief explanation of it. There's a few other elements to it, but the one we need to concern ourselves with most is the fact that there will be some customs checks at the ports. So essentially, you have a little bit of this to avoid reopening all of these, which are land-based customs posts. There's an abandoned one because they haven't been needed for almost 30 years on the land border. So to me, that's a bit of a no-brainer, really. You examine things at the ports. There's already loads of infrastructure. There are narrow gateways, and things can flow back and where you can examine things without really even needing to build anything, really. It's already there situated. But the problem was then what happened was this got tied in with identity politics. And suddenly examining sausages for whether the correct VAT was paid on them or not became like part of your identity. And a substantial portion of the population felt what was happening with this model is they're being split from their homeland, and their home nation was being broken up. The United Kingdom has been broken up in this insidious, legalistic insertion from the dastardly EU. But that's where we are right now. That's the kind of the situation, hence our discontent. And it's really it's a key thing in Northern Irish politics at the moment, which is where I'm talking to you from, by the way. I'm speaking to you from Belfast. It's like it's on the news every single day, and right now it's been debated quite hotly, and it seems like maybe there's going to be some sort of compromise is going to be emerging. I actually thought I might be able to tell you one, because there's all these rumors that there might be some kind of new deal signed over these days right now, although it hasn't actually appeared. So that's where we are right now. I've been walking around a bit lately photographing graffiti to try and read it like a book, to try and find some meanings to it, you know, to try and analyze it. And there's quite a lot about the sea border, as they refer to it, this trade control processes that are going on in Northern Ireland's ports. So there's some articulation of political will happening without, when denied the normal forums. So that's an interesting one. In Northern Ireland, graffiti frequently is in the news. It's kind of a big deal in a way. It sort of gets reported on. It gets reported on when it's nasty, like this one. So that there is in Larne, or was in Larne, which is one of those 3 ports I mentioned where things are, cargo comes in from the rest of the UK. And that, as you can see, is a clear present threat to people who work in the port. So there's that. So suddenly the specter of violence reemerges. And indeed, I was walking around there with my camera, and I got questioned a couple of times from port security staff, because they're a bit edgy at the moment, naturally enough. So that's part of the discontent I was talking about. And as I mentioned, at the moment, we're in the grip of it. I've also taken some walks to look at another aspect of discontent. I've also taken some walks in areas of Belfast that would be considered nationalist. So areas where people would ideally just not have a border at all, a united Ireland. Obviously, there's going to be lots of political shades within those communities, but broadly speaking, nationalist areas. And I thought this one was quite interesting. The exit So I'm not even sure I say that. Exit, I guess, maybe. And at first, you might be looking at that and thinking that's some people wanting to throw their lot in with Brexit and kind of go along with that political shift. That wouldn't really be it, though, because like I'm saying, this is coming from a nationalist area, and they probably, chances are the graffiti artist here is consider themselves sort of oppositional to that. This is part of a different trend, rooted more in the Republic of Ireland, which is something similar to Brexit in that it's anti-EU. Now, as Eve Patton there mentioned, actually the overall position of Ireland in the EU is actually very comfortable. And it's not going to happen anytime soon, any kind of Irish exit from the EU. But all the same, there is such a thing. It does exist. And perhaps as we move into recession, which seems likely, maybe that voice is going to become louder, at least as a kind of a scapegoat. But yes, it does exist. It's not coming from the British Brexit was, I think, founded a lot on anti-immigration and some cultural inheritance concerned with ideas of sovereignty. Whereas Irish exit notions are probably more to do with an anti-colonial sense about in relation to the EU. And indeed, the idea of labour being able to move around, free labour moving around, does have its issues for the left. So that is about, and indeed where I'm from the west of Ireland. I'm from a fishing town. The entire town's economy is based on fishing. My father was a fisherman. Being against the EU is very common, actually. Indeed it's standard antagonism to the EU. This year is a protest that took place in Dublin last year, and there are some of my townspeople who brought their trawlers around. But again, they aren't really pushing to leave the EU, but I think that's largely because they know nobody will listen to them. But they are one voice that's been consistently antagonistic towards the EU for at least a generation. So again, discontent. Jen mentioned at the beginning I was going to talk about my book about the border, but I think I'm just going to focus on the map. There's a map in the book. And this subject of discontent was something that I felt was kind of worth charting. It's something I'm trying to do right now with graffiti and wall writing. But previously I've examined the border very closely, looking for, well, I guess among other things, points of discontent, although I didn't think about it that way at the time. This is years ago now, I started with this map, which is all of defensive structures along the border. Ones that are currently existing, but also lots that were just ruins and were destroyed or even gone entirely. So like defensive structures from the Troubles, so which were all dismantled in the 1990s, but I was charting them as well also. So I was looking for, I suppose, common stories in the narrative of how we control a landscape, and that's what this map was about. And it always came down to these sort of strong points, so castles and forts and checkpoints and gun placements and all these kind of structures. So I was charting them anyway, but then, after a while, so you got to the obvious ones, you got the obvious ones like there's some Troubles architecture, watchtower there in the bottom right-hand corner, checkpoint there where your car would have been stopped and possibly searched as you attempted to cross the border. So they're pretty obvious examples of defensive architecture. But then you kind of think, well, a customs hut, there's one now in Donegal, and as you can see, it's like a little, it's just like a little garden shed, isn't it? It's pretty harmless looking little thing, but yet it tells you you're entering another country, and it's a kind of a country asserting itself, asserting its regulations at its frontier. So I started thinking, well, that sort of counts as the architecture of nation as well, of claiming land, of power. So I started charting them as well. And then once you start doing that, it's hard to know where to stop. Almost everything that people build starts to look like some sort of statement, some sort of claim being made about belonging, and often to the exclusion of others. So I didn't know where to stop, really. And then I really decided I wanted to include protests. And now, in our winter of discontent, protests along the border have re-emerged. This because of that fear I mentioned right at the beginning of my talk, where I talked about the possibility that Brexit would mean a new hard border in Ireland. At that point, when that was looking not just possible, but actually likely, there was all sorts of protests along the border. So here you see they've set up a customs point, but this is performance art here, folks. This is just like somebody trying to kind of G everybody up, show them this is what it's going to be like if we allow this border to be re-secured. You see, they called it British customs, even though really in reality it would be EU customs is what would have happened. If there are border checks on Ireland's border, it'll be the EU who enforce them. In fact, it'll be the Republic of Ireland that enforce them, because they're the ones who are defending the single market in Europe. The British Republic just leave them. But that's who they're blaming. So that's who gets on the sign. So and then came to the book, and I was producing the map for the book, and the whole range of what I was charting had just got out of hand, really, and all sorts of things were getting thrown in there. And you can see on the top left, you might be able to see it, protest, one down from the top corner. But I don't know, I think protests are in their place. Somebody pointed out that you could look at 1,000 maps of Britain and you'd find all the battle sites, all the famous battles, but you would never find the miners' strike or the Wapping dispute or any of these things. It's just an aspect of history that tends to get left off the maps. So I was quite pleased to be able to give it a place. And then when the paperback of the book came out, they let me go back in and meddle with the maps again. And I was able to include that. You can see it middle top there, protest against hard border, because which is the one I just showed you the photograph of. So that was the most recent protest. And I was able to add it at that point. So just for the last couple of minutes, I'll show you another thing, which is not really a protest. As you can see, it's far too civilized, but it has that air of discontent all the same. And this, again, Jen at the beginning mentioned the suspension of the Northern Irish Assembly, which has happened a number of times. It's a very fractious place. And at this point, it was suspended again, 2018, which meant the building was empty. Such a nice building. So we had an event there where we got together about 150 people from the border, and we had a parliament where we got them to come up and tell, in a sense, tell us about life on Ireland's border. And I was brought in to kind of help run it and organize some responses. That's me there on the right with a microphone looking like the singer at a wedding or something. And one thing we did was we handed out cards and got people to tell us. We tried to frame it very positively. That one of the questions was, what can Ireland's border teach the world? You know, and we got them to ask them about the culture of the border and things like this. And they all produced these little cards. So we got about 200 of these little cards were prepared by the border dwellers. And then they had dinner, and we all had a laugh as well. After, as everybody was leaving, then they posted their cards into this box, which is the very box used in the Northern Irish Assembly whenever they're voting on any topic. So then afterwards, I collected them all up, and I had a terrible job, really, of trying to distill them all down into a single document. I say it was terrible, but it wasn't as hard as I kind of thought it would be, because there was an awful lot of agreement, you know. And some of these people a lot of these people were against Brexit, but some of them would have voted for Brexit. But they still were anxious about reinstating the hard border. Again, at that time, 2018, this again felt like a possibility that the border was going to get reinforced, that all these checkpoints were going to get reopened. That was very much in the air at the time. It's less so now, but at the time that was the anxiety. So then I got them all together, and we made a thing called the Yellow Manifesto, where I boiled it all down to 9 points. If you're interested in reading it, you can find it online very easily. And it's been exhibited quite a lot. That's it there in Belfast. I was in Dusseldorf there for a while. I'll show you just a couple of quotes from it. Number 9. Again, so let's see if there's any related there. So I'm taking the lines that I got on the cards and sort of editing them and melding them, and also trying to capture something of their cadence as well, something from the border accent also. It's impossible to do perfectly, but I did my best with it. And one more. And there, I suppose, there was a lot of discontent in the room, to be honest, because of the anxiety of the time about what Brexit might do to the border. However, I suppose partly because we framed the questions in quite positive ways, that discontent was, in the end, the document was quite an optimistic one. And I hope that ends up being the correct tone for where we're going into, a closer tone at the end of this period of discontent. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Garrett. And thank you to all the panelists for these really fascinating contributions. It's really lovely to see how the pieces are speaking to one another. So John, would you like to respond to the panelists? And I would like to just, again, encourage folks to put any questions or comments that you might have in the Q&A.
Okay, I'll just remind folks who I am. I'm John Carson. I'm an artist, recently retired professor from Carnegie Mellon University School of Art. I'm originally from Belfast in Northern Ireland. So deeply interested in the topic. I'm really grateful for 3 wonderful presentations, a lot to think about. I have some thoughts. They're not maybe coherent at this point, but just some thoughts, some questions that come out of the presentations and the ideas that were put forward. In Eve's presentation, she talked about Ireland's historical relationship with Europe, and how that's happened through literature, and now that, you know, the Trinity are trying to encourage visual arts practice that crosses the border between Ireland and Europe. The thing occurred to me as well about European identity, European culture. One of the topics today is kind of thinking about the nature of Irish identity and what that is today. And it kind of struck me that when Brexit did happen, there's a huge rush of people who are not even Irish, trying to get Irish passports. You know, so there's a desire for an Irish identity because people see something in the Irish situation that is more appealing than than what's happening in their own country or their own circumstance. So I think that desire to be Irish is a kind of interesting thing to explore. And then there was Eve also mentioned linguistic hospitality. Something I've been thinking about a lot on recent trips to Dublin, that when I walk the streets of Dublin, I hear many languages, particularly European languages. And, the people in Ireland aren't always hospitable to hearing those languages, in the streets of Dublin. But Ireland is a much kind of my sense of Ireland is much different, than because of the relationship with Europe and because of the workers traveling and because of the free movement that occurred as part of the EU. There's also something that came up. I'm a little bit out of order here, but in terms of border culture, in a way, Maria touched on it. Garrett really kind of went there. I'm curious, about the identity of border people, and you brought it in at the end with your border parliament. There's some people tend to think of, the border as a dividing line, but it's also a connecting line. And there's a kind of life or a culture that occurs on both sides of a border that's a kind of merging of two identities or two groups of people, and maybe there's a kind of mix of identities or sense of identities to people who live in the border. So I'd be interested for Garrett to tease that out a little bit more. What is the character of people that live in the border, and you've actually physically negotiated the border between the north and south of Ireland, and Maria does it in her work, so there's a kind of both of you have dealt with the border as symbolically, but also dealt with it, territorially or geographically or in terms of landscape. So in Maria's presentation, she also seemed to she brought out the fact that borders are not necessarily forever, that they're not necessarily permanent. And we've experienced that, with the situation in Ireland with Brexit. And I think that's just an interesting point to keep in our heads, that a border tells us about a certain place at a certain time, a certain territory, and a certain kind of ownership at a particular time. That might not always be the case. And so there are histories that ignore the border or that treat the border in a different way. So those are just some of the things that I'm beginning to think about on the basis of the presentations. So I don't know whether any of the panelists want to respond to some of those thoughts.
Could I come in, Jennifer? Just, I know we'll go to questions, but I think John has really hit the nail on the head by recognizing that paradoxical identity of a border is that it is not only a site of division and perhaps repression, but also it can be so productive. It can be a site of tremendous creativity, even though that creativity is full of, political difficulties. And, this is obvious from what Garrett has been talking about and what Mairead has been talking about, but also from, what social historians have been able to show about the Irish border in the 100 years of its existence, that it's often been, strangely, a site of play, a site of jokes, and then increasingly a site that produced a kind of culture or produced cultural activities and effects. How we assess that is a real problem because it's not a straightforward appreciation or congratulation that we have to to send across. But the other thing I just wanted to raise while John has talked about everybody rushing for their Irish passport so that we can, they can remain European. For me, one of the most problematic borders that remains in an Irish culture and society is in fact the border, the imagined border between Western European and Eastern European identities. The Europe that came to Ireland over the past 15, 20 years has largely been Romanians, Polish communities, Lithuanians, who came because of freedom of movement, who settled in Ireland. But there's still an anxiety, I think, there's still a doubt about whether they're properly European in the way that Ireland wants to recognise Europe, which is the older tradition of looking to France, looking to Germany, looking to the west of the European continent. So I think there is still tensions and difficulties about what we understand to be a European identity, and perhaps blind spots in the way that Irish society receives and accommodates its European community.
Thank you for that, Eve. And when we're continuing to extend that concept of the linguistic hospitality, when we think about Irish English as a contact language, we also have the linguistic precedence of that hybridity, as well as the productive tension between the language systems of Irish and English in that particular form of English as it's spoken and written in Ireland as well. We have two questions here that I think allow us to continue to extend this and allow some of our other panelists to chime in. They're not directly related, but I think that they communicate with one another. So Professor Olsen was really interested in the ways in which Brexit has led to questions pertaining to reunification in Ireland. And we also have a question from Barbara Ferizzi on the impact of the border on the younger generations. So I'll just put that out there, and feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to chime in on either one of these questions.
Well, Barbara's question's directed to me. I don't know, I'm not the new generation. I don't think you mean me, Barbara. But I mean, it's a good question. I suppose the thing is really the new generation is that the border has been pleasingly ineffective for them. It's you know, you really, so it was 92, 93, both the UK and Ireland joined the EU. So all the trade barriers went down and all the customs posts disappeared. And then 97 peace process, and when all the military defenses were dismantled. And then the border just became open country between North and South of Ireland. So the effect it's had is that they were the first generation. Well, they were, yeah, the first living generation to live without the border, really, essentially, and they it no longer so central to their identity, I suppose. And what I found was with projects like the Border People's Parliament, we had all ages there, right down to little children, and what I found was it was the older ones who were much more anxious actually about the future. It was people in their 50s and 60s who wrote the notes that were a little more fraught, and I think that's because they're the ones who could remember what it was like during the Troubles, and they could remember how badly things could turn and how things could spiral out of control and how quickly it could happen. So it was the older ones who were more anxious than the young ones, in my limited experience.
Murray, do you want to chime in on this with some of your work?
Well, no, I was just thinking about in my experience of even, you know, when the border was there and more obvious. I mean, you're in a border country, like I was growing up, you know, the diocesan borders are different again. So, you know, the Armagh diocese stretches down into the south, as well as up into the, you know, County Tyrone. So there would have been connections through, if you were religious, or going to mass or going to church, there would be always communication and talking about that particular boundary, which went over the official border. So there were that certainly has became much easier as well once the actual physical border changed, and it became much easier to move across. And even for children going to school, my niece goes to a school and some of the children come over the border to go to that school. Now that's going to be much more difficult because of Brexit. Those kinds of things are rearing their head. But in my project, in my film, a line was drawn, and part of that I was looking back to when the border was, when it began, and how this sort of idea of people smuggling very basic goods. So they would be used to going to a particular town to bring their chickens or their cows or whatever, and all of a sudden they would be stopped and say, you're not allowed to take your cow down there to market, or you're not allowed to take those chickens. And so, I mean, again, in the archives you will find a book which lodges all of the things that people were being pulled up for and saying, you can't do this. So there's all of these legacies, these memories of things that were going, that people endured, and and because of the change from even just a few years, that changed. So I just found all of that very interesting. And again, as Garrett says, the point where there's a possibility of those kinds of obstacles coming in our way again, or is there an alternative way of thinking about this and reframing it? And I just, it's an interesting one, because we're in the middle of it now and we don't know how it's all going to pan out. And there's other places, other countries who have experienced it. It's not just, but it's where we're at this moment, at this time. And it's just an interesting thing to examine.
I was interested in Garrett's notion of, you used the term political identity for the presumably unionists, people who work at the ports, who don't want to deal, have to deal with the tax on the sausages that come from England or whatever, So it's kind of interesting that they can always find another way of saying no. Something gets put in place that they don't like, and it's another kind of negative reaction. So within the kind of Irish identity, I'm also interested in the fact that there is a very distinct northern identity as compared to southern identity, and that's whether you're Catholic or Protestant living in the north. It's just because it's been a different culture, a different kind of life experience living in the north of Ireland, and people's sense of Irishness. People from the north, have a different sense of Irishness than people from the south. I would say, people from, historically the north is Ulster, and I think there's been a kind of Ulster identity that's always been quite distinct, or from history.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Yeah, and as regards, you asked earlier about the border culture, and even I are working on a project about that, which is about sort of the outputs of border culture. So it's looking at actual tangible creation, whether journalism, books, art, music, hopefully. But then there is kind of I suppose the sociological question, and I get asked that quite a bit. I don't really have a great answer, but I would say the border is quite a discrete place where people are. I suppose because you're on this, there's this where political alliances can fuel such strong emotion that therefore people become quite discreet and quite reserved. And I remember even I was sitting in a cafe in a little town called Caledon, which is right near the border, and I'd arranged to meet a friend of mine from Dublin, and he came up and he was sitting with me, and I couldn't get over how loud he was. Just his voice was so loud. I've been on the border for a few weeks, and it's like, will you stop shouting? Because I don't know, where the border a bit more kind of, but sort of a bit more careful. But I don't really want to make it sound fearful. That would kind of be wrong. It's actually very respectful as well, and in a sense of people needing a bit of space and distance, you know. And when I talk about political alliances triggering potentially all sorts of aggro with people you just want to get along with, that's something we've known in Northern Ireland for a long time. But now the rest of the world, I think, is kind of come down to our level. And in the United States, of course, where whether you're red or blue seems to have taken on an emotional culture war aspect to it that means people will cease to be friends. You know, people will stop speaking to their brothers and sisters over it. So it becomes, and that's the situation in Northern Ireland we really had since partition, if not before. And what you see in the border is a culture that evolves when people learn to live with that and find ways to get along despite it. And that's the kind of thing I mentioned. That was one of our questions in the Border People's Parliament. What can the border teach the world? And a couple of people reference things like that, as we know how to get along, even though we're in many ways opposed ideologically. And that's something I would identify as a border characteristic.
I'm kind of interested, Maria, in your, is it kintsugi?
Yeah, kintsugi, yeah.
Japanese kind of repairing culture. Very kind of beautiful item which you showed. But and also I'm really excited by the fact that you're working on something new, a new film, and that it has a aspect of mapping. But it seems to me you're talking as much about mapping time
Yes,
as mapping landscape or space.
absolutely. Yeah, going definitely time, because there's, I want to, referencing the 700 years of Irish history, which, in terms of what's in the archive. So you're looking at connections, if you find the material that's been found, and copies and facsimiles of this material that was lost in the fire. So you're looking at, like, trade routes that, were established 700 years between, sort of ports. They go to Portugal, they go to Spain, they go to France, and what the goods that were bought and sold from there, the wine that was coming in and where it was going to, and it's fascinating. Or, the fact that priests, the seminaries, they went to Europe, they studied there until, Maynooth College was set up in the late 1700s. So there's lots of really fascinating stuff, and going right back to medieval times. It's wonderful what's there.
I heard a story, I don't know whether it's apocryphal, but about the priest that was working on his illuminated manuscript off the coast of Ireland, and he ran out of purple or a particular violet color, which you could only get from a certain insect in Afghanistan.
Right.
So I don't know whether he sent somebody to fetch it or what, or whether he got that finished or changed color or whatever.
Yes, yeah.
But it's just incredible to think about that, that distance and that.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And what I'm really interested in is sort of trying to puncture holes through time, that you can see something 700 years ago and you can find a link to it now. It may be abstract, or maybe, but it's there, that sort of that idea of time travel that takes you from but it continues this thing that I'm interested in, which is how to map and say not only land but time. Yeah, very much so.
So I think we'll close our session with our last question here from Eleanor, who thanks everybody for the panel, and she asks if the panel could speak to the wall art of Belfast as augmenting the border, or how does graffiti change a border?
Well, I don't know if the wall out there you're referring to the murals, or you're talking about the kind of graffiti that I was looking at earlier. Augmenting the border. Yeah, I suppose sort of. In a way, it's more real. The border is more real in urban spaces in Northern Ireland. This is the thing. Because now, currently, at least while it's open, there is nothing on the border. All you see are fields, and you cross it easily without realizing. And most people would like to see it stay that way. So it's actually in the urban spaces where people are acting it out, and they're spraying things up or painting murals to mark off their neighborhoods from. So Unionist and Republican neighborhoods are kind of signposted as a part, and much more clearly than the border on the actual land border, on the actual frontier. And in some ways, that's what inspired my project. Really, I just thought these people are acting out this border in the urban spaces, but if you actually went there, it's just a load of cows, right? So what do you got? I mean, if you're actually acting it out, you just get a load of cows and you just send them up the street in Belfast, and then you've actually performed the border in the city. But instead, they were performing an idea of the border, that it should be this confrontational, binary kind of space. So they're not actually just augmenting the border, they're kind of making it more so than it is actually on the landscape in urban places. And as to graffiti changing a border, I don't know about that really. I don't know. Number one, there's not much actually on the border. Again, it's been performed in the urban space. It's been performed around my neighborhood. You don't see graffiti on the border itself so much. It's a rural kind of place. And even here, even in the city, I find them quite poignant in a way. Well, not the really nasty, aggressive ones, but a lot of them, they're like little messages in bottles that have just been sent out, hoping somebody will read them and feel for the person who wrote them there. They're awful lonely things in a way, I think, those messages written on walls, trying to be understood. So no, I don't think they're exactly changing anything. They're just a sort of a whimper in the dark, but you know, they might get together, they might team up, and then you could actually have a political force at some point.
The performance of the border in the urban environment, though, I think is a really important reminder when the stakes are smaller and the expanse of land is more limited. So in the urban environment, the proximity calls for a different, almost kind of improvisation of that performance of borders.
Sometimes those slogans are those pieces of graffiti turn into slogans, which become a kind of mantra, which do, you know, inform a certain opinion. I'm just thinking of that classic, we will not sacrifice the blue skies of Ulster for the, am I right here? For the grey skies of an Irish Republic. You know, it's one piece of, it's piece of graffiti which repeats because it's become a kind of mantra for a certain section of the population. So they can sort of assist the cause in a certain way if it gets picked up by a group of people.
No, you're right. They can become part of the vocabulary. And in fact, it was the first IRA ceasefire. Somebody on the Antrim Road wrote "Time for Peace" in white letters, and a lot of you will recognize that. There's a famous photograph of a little boy jumping up beside it, and it's one of the most famous images ever to come out of Northern Ireland. It really traveled the world, and it's a piece of graffiti. So, and it's not well done or anything, it's just done with like a house brush. But yet it's, in some ways, it's one of the most influential texts that have come out of Northern Ireland. It's certainly one of the most recognizable. So yeah, I think graffiti has traction here, yeah, in a way that might surprise people from other parts of the world.
Well, on that note, I just wanted to say thank you so much to our panelists and to the European Studies Centre for hosting this conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyable.
Thank you. I had me do.
All right.
Bye.
Well, with that, goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Enjoy
Thank
the
you.
rest of your
Bye.
day, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jennifer.